Hello, everyone. So, welcome back. So, I'm here with other speakers who will be joining this um, panel discussion. So, we had I think, I think you need to mute it uh, from your side. Yeah, great. So, I'll be introducing you the speakers of the panel following this spotlight presentation by Mark. So we have Noel Sobelman, whom you have already seen in action in the previous panel discussions and also in his keynote presentation. So Noel is Innovation and PPM Practice Lead at Change Logic. Noel is working with corporate leaders to accelerate core business vitality while simultaneously building new growth businesses, specializing in the areas of growth strategy, innovation capability building, portfolio management, organizational design, ecosystem development, and digital enablement. So glad to have Noel on board and welcome Edric Engert. He's managing director with Alvarez and Marshall Healthcare Industry Group in Tampa, Florida. He is an experienced healthcare leader with more than 25 years of experience as a pharmaceutical executive and consultant across various healthcare sectors. And he has been with the PPM Summit many times before. So, welcome back, Edric. So, happy to have you all on board. So, let's let's move to the questions and also to the audience. If you have any questions you want us to include in the discussion, so feel free to include them in the chat. My first question for you: what are the key elements to of setting up a process to include? Sorry. So, what are the key elements of setting up a process to incorporate voice of the market into portfolio choice?
I'll perhaps start with a simple organizational and structural piece. I think it's easy to jump into an answer around the specific tactics and tools that one can use, and I'd be very interested in hearing Mark and Noel exactly what your thoughts are there, because at some point we have to have something that is implementable in detail. However, I'd like to start with some of the barriers and inertia that sometimes exist far before you can even think of executing and implementing such a thing. And that is the organizational design and portfolio selection process itself. I have personally found in the world of novel biologics where I have played, I have seen it in biosimilars, and I've even seen it in generics, that oftentimes, if we look at biologics, R&D is making decisions based entirely on how big is the prize and what's the technical difficulty. And when I look at some companies in the generic space, somebody asks for a solution and R&D says, we don't have capacity for that. And they say, okay, and they walk away and try to find another product. I think oftentimes a rather transformational play needs to be made in the basics of organizational design and decision making, so that it's very clear that you have all the different key functions existing early in the planning and decision-making process. And I think the reason why sometimes that falls apart is because some companies have the tendency to think that somehow all these functions are sequential. We start with strategy. Strategy goes to portfolio. Portfolio goes to R&D. R&D goes to manufacturing. Manufacturing goes to sales and marketing, and there you have it. These things are not linear at all. To come up with the proper solutions and to frankly also be agile enough to market changes as well as opportunities that emerge and sort of percolate from the bottom up. All these functions, in my opinion, have to be engaged in the process from day one. And I'll stop there and hand it off to others, please.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's two techniques or methodologies that I'm really excited about that are getting more attention these days, and that's applying jobs theory and really taking the extra time and to really empathize with the different stakeholders and really understanding their unmet needs and how important they are and if they're underserved. And this is especially for those of you that are working beyond the molecule, because those, if you really do it well, what I've learned, that can cut down your cycle time in getting to validating a solution. If you spend the time, as they say, falling in love with the problem, not the solution. So really, I think there's some practical methodologies for doing this that go beyond design thinking, and there's some interesting work that Tony Ulwick, who's kind of a pioneer of this thing called outcome-driven innovation, where you really tap into what is the job that the stakeholders trying to get done. So I see more companies applying that. The second to really get related to decision making is just getting customer evidence. Instead of just relying on an ROI projection, there's always uncertainty in that projection, and the financial part of making a trade-off decision as to which projects you take on or continue to fund. But really understanding where is the uncertainty in that projection, and taking that uncertainty or the assumptions you're making, the hypotheses you're making, and going and testing with customers and stakeholders to really understand and de-risk that by empathizing with them and running low-cost experiments to learn from them. So you bring back to the decision makers evidence of that you've validated a solution. So to go along with the traditional financial metrics, now you have some evidence, especially when you're dealing with new markets or new technologies where there's heavy uncertainty. So applying those two methodologies, I think, is where some of the more progressive companies are heading.
Just to build on that, Noel, for a moment, I see that being incredibly applicable in so many places, even in the phase of clinical development, because you'd be surprised how often I've seen clinical trials start to be structured and created without some of those fundamental questions being answered yet as to exactly what is the need, and not just in aspirational terms, but clearly measurable terms that determine exactly what the unmet medical need is, so that when you go and spend the time and the money on clinical development, it's not just about the time of submission. It's about that you're submitting something that can actually capture real value, not just financially, but for the health of the patient as well. So I couldn't agree with you more on what you said.
All great insights. I'll just add that I have seen where companies are able to drive these kinds of best practices that you both are talking about. Those companies that are able to do that value portfolio management as a strategic process, as opposed to just a data collection process or kind of a back office staff function. Because, Edric, to the point you just made, being able to ask those kinds of specific trade-off type questions. What is the actual need here, and how does that compare to the ratings we have on our competing investments? For someone to actually hear that, executive stakeholders to hear that and actually work to answer that, that's a tough question. And it's sometimes hard to answer the tough questions. Many times it's just easier to stay with the status quo. And when the portfolio process is seen as strategic and valued, then those tough questions get pursued.
See, Mark, I couldn't, wow, I'm agreeing with everyone like 100%. This is very interesting how much what you're saying resonates with me so much. What you said that is strategic, I think is of paramount importance, because I've worked a lot in the strategy space. I've worked a lot in R&D strategy and business development and M&A, and then even creating commercialization models and how you sort of loop them all together and turnarounds of pharmaceutical firms. But the one thing that I think people often miss is exactly this point that you just made, Mark, the strategic value of portfolio selection and management. Because in my view, and hopefully I'm not oversimplifying this, but you think of higher altitude corporate strategy, aspirations, financial strategic objectives. That's sort of the what. And then there's the how do you actually do it? You have all these different functions. You have purchasing, you have API sourcing supply, you have supply chain, you have manufacturing, you have clinical development. All these things have to now be operationalized. And in my humble opinion, portfolio selection is the bridge. It is the single unilateral bridge between strategy and objectives and the operations to get it done.
Yeah, the other point I'll make is that it's a dynamic process. This is not a once a year exercise. These days, we're talking about you need to constantly, periodically, I should say, check in and revisit your portfolio, rationalize your portfolio. What are we not going to do in order to accelerate the higher value opportunities? Those are the kinds of questions that you just can't wait around for an annual review. It just doesn't cut it anymore. So I think most companies are having a kind of a quarterly cadence where you revisit those priorities, even in the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you say that, because the way how I put it is there has to be a top-down approach. Because if you came up with a corporate strategy, you can't just say, oh, look, we got a fancy corporate strategy now in a PowerPoint presentation, yay, and then put it on a shelf somewhere. You have to figure out top-down, how do I now start to build the products and the infrastructure to deliver? So you do need that top-down annual process or kickoff or whatever you want to call it. But if you only do the top-down, you completely miss the opportunistic plays, the things that bubble up because of changes in the competitive landscape, because of changes in the market dynamics. And I think this sort of combination of disciplined top-down but opportunistic bottom-up is, I think, what is exactly needed, not only in portfolio selection, but also, frankly, in business development and in licensing as well.
Thank you, everyone. So wonderful ideas, and I can't agree more with you. Let's move to the next question. How is this process? How this process would differ across different markets, U.S., Europe, emerging markets, and across different products like innovative drugs and treatments, generic drugs and biosimilars, medical devices?
Which process in particular? Can you just define that very clearly?
Yeah, the process of incorporating the voice of market into the portfolio choice.
I'll freely admit.
Go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
I'll be quick. I freely admit I don't have a whole lot of experience in going across multiple different markets and carrying those products, but I have worked for global companies that have grappled with this. And I will say, in my presentation that I just did, the example of a company, a global medical device company that had been focused traditionally on Western healthcare markets, and then now trying to take the existing products and understand how it adds value in the developing emerging markets was a very telling experience. And what ended up happening is it revealed very quickly that our internal decision makers, it was a lot more we had oversimplified it. We had looked at emerging markets just simply as being not able to afford the same things in the same ways that Western markets would be able to afford. And so it was really mainly a conversation about affordability, when in reality, it was much more complex about that. There was differences in infrastructure, in security, in skill sets, and capabilities that needed to be represented in our kind of voice of the market comprehension.
And I was going to say, I think that the tools that are available to analyze your portfolios, you can slice and dice in so many different ways, and you might have your geographic based investment buckets, but to the point of the getting the voice. I mean, most of the clients I work with, they pick one market, they develop to the needs of that market, and then they take it to other markets. But they think that out up front. They don't, they think about that staged rollout early enough to where they're not locking themselves out from a regulatory standpoint or what have you. And then the other thing is, a lot of them seem to make, maybe the right strategic decision is to start in the market where the regulatory hurdles are the lowest, just being practical about it.
Yeah, and I think it's also very interesting because the answer to your question, Mithun, can vary depending on the sub-industry that you're in, but also the region that you're in. So for example, if we break it up again into small molecule, big pharma, novel biologics, biosimilars, and generics, I'll go to the end of that spectrum. I'll go to generics. You could think of a market like the United States, and you could think of a market like Israel, and you say, well, that's an INN market. That's that's all about substitution. So where does the patient perspective really come in? Frankly, not at all. But not every market is like that. Not every market is perfectly substitutable. There are lots of markets where even though it's a generic product, it's treated from a marketing perspective and from a prescribing perspective as if it were a branded drug. There are lots of examples of this. Russia and a lot of CE countries are exactly like that too, where a sort of branded generic, so to speak, of sildenafil is one of the giant selling products in a country like Russia. So what's interesting is that you have to look very carefully at the dynamics of patient decisions, how prices are determined, and the regulatory hurdles, as you pointed out, Noel, to figure out from both a risk perspective as well as a value perspective, what decision do I make where? And then if you start adding that up region by region, it also then influences, do I actually do regional development in portfolios or do I do global development in portfolios? And your answer could be incredibly different depending on the product that you're looking at. If I move to something like biosimilars, sometimes you do want to think about the patient. You might be thinking of a new formulation. Do I go with a low concentration or a high concentration? What should be my reference product? If I'm going after something that uses a device, which device is the most suitable for the needs of the patient? And that just comes down to primary market research with specialists and with patients, so that you realize it's not always just about the drug. It's also about the ease of administration, given the device, and how they can vary actually by reference products. And then, of course, on the branded side, it's much more driven, much more directly by exactly the more, I think, traditional methods of understanding how to connect best with the patient, with the customer. But it's incredibly complex. And then it creates all these other layers of decisions and forks in the road as to what do you develop, when do you globalize, when do you regionalize, and how does it even affect timing?
Great, I absolutely agree, and so relevant comment. And we have one comment from Monica, who says that based on her experience, she would say depends on the stage of development to a degree. Early stage, there is a bit more leeway, and it is around CDP for the program or projects from ROI perspective. So later it could be more from launch, order, payer perspective, etc. And the needs based on the market could be different. The strategy has to be global from the get-go if the global markets are what the company wants to operate in. So absolutely agree. I think the payer perspective, we should not forget it. Especially early in the stage when you're deciding the strategy and the rollout. And I know so many of the products where we had huge regulatory hurdles, especially in a few specific countries, which are quite innovative with the requirements that they want for the submissions, where they take the regulatory requirements from FDA, from the European authorities, and they want to make even more robust requirements. And when you realize about what you have to be conforming to, it's too late. So absolutely agree.
So one quick reaction. I very much appreciate the perspective that Monica just shared with us, and I'm in very much agreement with her. However, it's again a perfect case example of how you have to decide what region, what sub-industry are you actually making this assertion for. This assertion that the payer dynamics become more relevant the later stage you are in development, clinical development. I would say what she says is spot on, but I would say it's spot on 90% of the time. And I'll give you a perfect counterexample and why this is such a complex space all across the board. You could be looking at a life cycle management strategy that an innovator has taken because of a loss of exclusivity that's coming down the horizon. And perhaps in the recent history, they've been very good at sort of product hopping, bringing all the volume of patients to this new piece. And you could therefore decide, well, that should be my reference product because I'll be much more protected there. And that's an early, I'm talking about biosimilars, by the way, right now. I'm not talking about novel biologics. And that could be a reasonable assumption at first blush. But then you have to peel back the onion a little bit and ask yourself, this life cycle management strategy that was employed by the innovator, was it really just for purposes of product hopping, or does it bring a substantial clinical benefit to the patient? Because if the answer is no to that last question, when the time comes to launch the product, no payer or PBM is going to care that this is the latest and greatest and that it's supposed to be, this very successful LCM strategy that was employed. It all comes down to what's the IP position and who can offer the best deal to the PBM or payer. So again, Monica, great point, true 90% of the time, but again, shows so clearly the complexity and all the different nuances that sometimes we have to peel back and understand even at the early stages of development when choosing even reference products.
Thank you, Edric. And we do have a question, another question from Monica. Sorry, yeah. The question is from Vladimir. He's curious about how effective multi-million portfolio decisions, for example, portfolio selection, could be made using tools of very limited capabilities, for example, sorting.
So I'm not sure what Vlad means by the sorting comment, but the tool is just an enabler for pulling together the data in a common database and sorting it and creating the different views of your portfolio, however you need it to support decision making. Yes, some of the standard off-the-shelf tools are limited in their capabilities to do some of the sophisticated analysis that you need in the biopharma industry. Whether it be Monte Carlo or some of the more sophisticated at-risk kinds of tools that are typically bolt on to the standard PPM platform. But yeah, I think he brings up a good point. I think you have to make that decision. Do you have the horsepower in the off-the-shelf tool, and do you need a bolt-on that allows you to run some more sophisticated modeling? I don't think some of these off-the-shelf tools just don't have that.
Agreed. I'll also add in that I've seen a variety of tools used to support a variety of different kinds of processes, everything from simple spreadsheets for doing sorting all the way up to far more complex tools. And it comes down to, I guarantee you, everybody here, the companies you're working for, you're using some kind of portfolio trade-off decision-making approach, whether it could be sticky notes, it could be no tool whatsoever. You may not even be using a spreadsheet, but some human beings somewhere are deciding where to place the bets. And so how do you want to facilitate, what kind of structure comes down to what are your decision makers comfortable with, and how much data are they willing to subscribe to? If they're not buying into the data you've collected and the roll-ups that you're providing, if they're not bought in, it's not going to change how they make the decisions today. So whether a tool, if they're not bought into the process, the tool won't help. It'll make it worse.
Yeah, and me too. And I would just add a little bit of a cautionary tale regarding tools, that anyone basing their decisions on any kind of tool, be it a sticky note, Excel spreadsheet, whatever it is, they have to have an incredibly rigorous understanding of the very foundation of the tool they're using. And I'll give you a personal example from my own life at a certain pharmaceutical firm that sure will remain nameless. Of course, I walked in to try to help out, and this is a generic firm where they were developing products, and portfolio and R&D were, of course, hand in hand. The head of R&D came to me concerned and said, could you help us out with this? Because the portfolio selection manager is turning the product on, then turning the product off, and it was constantly on, off, on, off. And I tried to find out why that was even happening. And the person responsible for portfolio told me, well, that's because the NPV changed. When the NPV goes below a certain threshold, I terminate the product. And when it's above a certain threshold, I say, oh, that product needs to go in. And in my opinion, it's a perfect case of somebody not really understanding what the purposes of NPV and its applicable use. Because the two questions I asked were, one, do you even have an NPV goal within the firm? Because to me, coming back to this comment, Mark, that I made before, when you pointed out very, very well how portfolio needs to be something strategic. What are your objectives, and how is portfolio helping you to achieve those objectives? Then operationalize it, when you go past portfolio. If you don't have an objective for NPV, that should not be your decision-making tool. NPV is nothing more than a stage gate process for deciding, do I move forward or not at this stage? Nothing more, nothing less. And as an interesting little exercise, what I did to sort of educate both sides of this argument, I showed them that you can give me a generic product that has this in branded sales. This is what we're going to assume is the market share. And this is how we think it's going to play out over time with erosion and compression rules. Watch what happens when I add just one competitor. Oh, look, you flip below the threshold. That one competitor decides to drop out. Look, you went above the threshold, in, out, in, out. So I very much agree with tools, but anyone basing decisions on tools better know exactly how they work and how they should best be used, where to use them, and frankly, when not to use them.
Yeah, your point, Eric, your example about an NPV threshold, I'd be concerned about the human element, people gaming the system to stay above the threshold so their project stays alive and that point. So, but yeah, I always say that whether you use NPV or what other evaluation criteria you use, NPV, a scoring model, the value really is in the discussion. That's a good starting point for a discussion. But there's just too many nuances and assumptions behind those NPVs and confidence levels. It really takes decision makers sitting around a table and having that discussion when you're prioritizing projects and figuring out what to invest in. And there's no magic algorithm out there.
Absolutely, and I so much agree to your cautionary tale, Edric. So many times, like you just you don't know exactly how the tool works, and you're just blindly thinking that the tool will solve the problem. I think you have to go with the process first, understand how it works, and also know the limitations of the tools that you have. If you don't know the limitation of tool and how this data is being calculated, you might get very, very faulty results, and especially there was a feedback from Monica about tools are as good as the data that goes in. So they are an enabler, and that alone, is her point. And I feel, yes, I have so many projects where, especially portfolios where I don't have the same detail of data and same kind of data at coming up from the projects, and consolidating at the portfolio level gave me like so many figures which were absolutely meaningless if I would not go and investigate what was being reported on those projects. And that's why you have to be so careful, especially when you are having a large portfolio. Once I had a portfolio of 78 projects, so it was the largest portfolio I ever had, and I just used all those tools which were it was SAP business BW, so I used that business warehousing to extract those reports, which were absolutely beautiful. But the fact that we didn't have data on a few projects, and which completely changed some huge indicators, was really the last minute thing. So especially when you realize those things day before at 9 p.m. and you have the meeting early next morning, I think those are the kind of those are the big surprises you might have.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple more cautionary tales, very, very much related to this. I find, as sort of a general statement, sometimes people depend a little bit too much on tools, because at times it can give anyone that's using the tool sort of a false sense of confidence. Well, I use this tool, therefore my answer must be right. And that's why I think I come back to what you said, Noel. Get the right people in the room to really roll up the sleeves that understand the industry. It's much better that way. The tool is just sort of step one. The other comment that I would make is, even though I'm a numbers geek and I love quantification of everything, literally, anytime you give me a point estimate, I can almost guarantee you that what you gave me is wrong. A single point estimate is a big no-no. You should always think about ranges and think about where the outcomes could go. I even do this with strategies. I don't create just a single strategy. We say there's scenario A, B, and C, and there's a strategy for each scenario. We think scenario B is most likely, so we'll go ahead and start implementing that strategy. But you better have the other ones in the back burner as soon as the market starts to move. And I've done that very often, not just in pharma, but even in medical malpractice insurers, et cetera. And my final comment is, sometimes we're in situations where we're going to argue about silly things like, I think there's a 24% chance. Well, I think it's a 32% chance. To me, that's sometimes silly because we're fighting for a level of precision that is unobtainable. And in those types of situations, I just cut through all the bull by saying, what's the break even? Tell me what the break even point is, because then all we have to do is, as a team, decide, are we above or below? I've done it when we've done launches at risk. I've done it when we didn't know how big a product was going to be and how much are we supposed to ramp up initial production for initial launch. Whenever there's this uncertainty, do the break-even analysis. It's so much easier than pretending that we can be so precise in our forecasts.
Yeah, and just one comment, just to hopefully put the tools discussion to bed, is I always tell people that the tool is like buying an exercise bike and thinking you're going to lose weight. So it's and it ends up sitting in the corner of the house, and
Right.
Absolutely. And we have Roseanne who commented that she would add process to the statement, and absolutely, the processes are so important. So we are almost out of time. Let's have one last question. So what is your framework and tools to manage risks and optimize market access?
I'll start with a prelude, and then I'm very interested in hearing what everyone else has to say. I think it's an enormous mistake to think that risk is a single homogeneous thing. It's not. There's so many different types of risks, and I think each one needs to be planned forward and mitigated separately.
Yeah, and I just would tie it to your gated development process too. That should be a slide in your presentation deck. Here's the project technology and business risks, and here's our mitigation plans, and then the point I made earlier about trying to de-risk or identifying where the risk is early and trying to de-risk before you start scaling your investment. So tie your risk mitigation earlier is better, and make sure that you de-risk prior to spending the big bucks when you're starting to really spend money on clinicals and development spending. So that means the first, the planning phases, you should be identifying where those risks are and what are some things we can do to de-risk.
Completely agree with both. I'll just tag on my comment that within your stage gate process, I have seen cases where the risk process is not persistent enough. Risks will be identified and get retired to a point where we're comfortable, in which case it gets left on a slide somewhere and gets completely forgotten about later in the stage gate process. And so you want to create that persistence so that you are remembering what your major risks are, and even if you've mitigated it or retired it enough to where you feel okay to move forward with stage gate, you still want to be aware of what those risks are, just to keep them on your radar and apply your resources accordingly.
Thank you very much. And I think we are running out of time. So thank you so much to all the three of you for this wonderful ideas. I really like the idea of to have a single unilateral bridge for the portfolio selection, which can. This bridge between the strategy and operations. I so much agree with you on this. And I like the idea of mixing the two, so disciplined top-down ideas and opportunistic bottom-up ideas in the portfolio selection. I like also thinking way ahead in the staged rollouts on different countries, and also think more deeply about how tools work and set the processes in place before making the decisions. So thanks to all of you for this wonderful session, and I think we can go on hours talking about these, but let's continue this discussion, and we'll go backstage, and I'll be back with the next speaker for the next spotlight session. So please stay tuned.
Thank you so much. Very engaging.